Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can be healthy naturally. Now, our guest today is Mark Gober. Mark is the author of the new book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, and he's also a partner in Sherpa Technologies, a firm that advises businesses on mergers and acquisitions and strategy. You can find out more about Mark and his work at markgober.com. Welcome, Mark Gober.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Now, Mark Gober, your book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, how did you get interested in this book? And if you could give our audience a synopsis, what's this book actually about? What are you talking about in this book?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a partner at a firm in Silicon Valley called Sherpa Technology Group. And prior to that, I worked in investment banking in New York. And prior to that, I was a student at Princeton University where I studied psychology, behavioral economics, and was captain of the tennis team. So when I tell people my background, they typically ask the question you asked, which is, how did you end up writing a book called An End to Upside Down Thinking, which is on the brain and consciousness? It doesn't really have a connection to my background. And it doesn't. This all kind of started for me in August of 2016 when I initially heard a podcast on Extreme Health Radio, which is an alternative health show. They interviewed a woman who talked about psychic abilities. Her name's Laura Powers. And then Laura mentioned her own podcast called Healing Powers, which I then just decided to listen to because I thought it was interesting. And the very short version is that I ended up listening to every episode dating back to 2011. I got curious enough to start reading books about it. And then I realized there was a whole body of evidence that challenged my worldview. So I ended up researching for about a year. And then in the summer of 2017, decided to write the book. So that's the story behind it. And in terms of the content itself, the book looks at what Science Magazine has called the number 2 question that remains in all of science, which is, how is it that our physical body and brain, like it's physical in that I can touch my arm or my leg, I can touch my body, but my consciousness or my awareness is not something I can touch. It's not physical. And this is the big question in science. It's kind of an open secret. How does the body or the brain produce consciousness? And my book is all about the evidence suggesting that the brain does not produce consciousness and that consciousness exists independently.
Well, one of the things that we know that I'm always talking to our audience about is that only 4% of the known universe can actually be measured, right? And there's this 96% of life of the universe that is qualitative and like love. You can't measure that. You know when it's there, you know when it's not there. But it's when we get into our consciousness and we get into our nonlinear thinking, that's when we can begin to access this. So
I agree with you.
Yeah. So your book is called An End to Upside Down Thinking. What do you actually mean by upside down thinking?
I'm referring to the conventional view in most of science today, which is known as materialism. And that idea is that the universe is fundamentally made of physical stuff called matter. So my table right here is made of atoms of matter. And the idea is as follows. There was a big bang 13.8 billion years ago. It filled the universe with these atoms of matter. And in this big universe, chance tells us that we're bound to end up with interactions between those pieces of matter. We call those interactions chemistry. So we started with matter, now we have chemistry. And then with random chemical reactions happening throughout this big universe, through chance, we're bound to end up with a molecule that can replicate itself. So that's like DNA. So DNA leads to the evolution of biology, like a human being, which develops a brain. And from the brain comes out consciousness, the subjective inner experience or awareness that everyone listening to this conversation or watching this conversation has right now. So this is materialism. It says that matter creates consciousness through a brain. And that is precisely the thinking that I'm challenging in my book by saying we don't have to get rid of physics, the material world, chemistry, biology, neuroscience. We just have to recontextualize consciousness. And instead of saying that consciousness comes at the very end of the chain, consciousness instead comes at the beginning. So to quote Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental and I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. That's why the book's called An End to Upside Down Thinking. It's not that matter creates consciousness, it's that consciousness is more fundamental than matter.
You know, you're bringing up something that's very fundamental to natural healing. And one of the things that we know is that how you think and how you feel actually creates your chemistry. Now, a real simple example of that is if you just think of biting into a lemon. So just for a moment, let's all think about biting into a lemon. And you can actually feel inside your mouth, and there's a sensation even in your whole body if you're sensitive and can tune in. So how you think and how you feel is actually creating the chemistry. And when we are working with natural healing, we're looking at the whole person. And this includes your emotions. This includes your thought patterns and your beliefs. And it even includes your soul experience, because it's these things that actually create what's going on in your physical body. Now,
yes, yeah.
Yes, you agree.
I agree. I wouldn't have agreed before I started my research, but now, yes, I do.
Yeah. So how you think creates your physical reality. And one of the things that I'm always talking about here on the Natural Healing Show is that illness or dis-ease begins in the energy field. It begins in the spiritual body, in the mental body, in the emotional, the energy body itself, the the energy body, the pranamana kosha, and then comes into the physical. And when we want to heal, it's got to go out. It's got to go out through the physical, out through the energy system, out through the emotions, out through the mind, and out through the spiritual body. So in my view, as a medical intuitive healer, if you're wanting to heal, you have to take into account all these different aspects of yourself. If you're only working on the physical, which is the result, then your ability to clear and to heal may become limited. When you say Mark Gober?
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll give you some examples that I think align with that very well, which is research from the University of Virginia, and it's been conducted over 50 years. And they've studied over 2,500 cases of children who are usually between the ages of 2 and 5 years old, who have very distinct memories of a life that is not theirs. They call it a previous life. And they'll give such specific details and have such specific preferences or aversions that the researchers can sometimes find historical or medical records that align precisely with what the child is describing. So they actually find the person that the child is describing as being that child's previous life. In some cases, the children have birthmarks or physical deformities that also line up with the way the person died in this other life. So going back to your point about basically other factors to consider in health versus the conventional thinking. In conventional medical thinking, there are two factors that can affect our physical form. One is genetics, our genetic makeup, and the other is environment. The environment affects us. And those are the two factors that affect our health. However, what is being suggested by the research from the University of Virginia is that there is potentially a third factor, and that's what they're calling it. There's some other factor that isn't physical, apparently, that is affecting health and physical form and memories and consciousness. So I think it's aligned with what you're describing.
Yeah, and this morning I saw a client who has chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, CIPD, which is a very fancy way for explaining that his nervous system doesn't work right, and he's lost sensations in his hands and feet and has difficulty walking. This is a brilliant gentleman. I'll just leave it at that. It was like yourself, he highly educated, was a major officer in a public company, and he's been tested at Harvard, at Mayo Clinic, and there's no case like him. And he started to work with me on the non-usual, non-material aspects of healing. And what's interesting, has difficulty walking, and I was helping him to his car today, and I'm like, you're walking better. It's like a physical result of working on the non-linear aspects of healing, which is very, very interesting. So anyway, so it's this 96%, the unknown, the unmeasurable. Now, Mark Gober, the author of An End to Upside Down Thinking, is there evidence that we all have telepathic abilities?
Yeah, so to give some context for why I'm looking at things like telepathic abilities and children with memories of a previous life, is that phenomena such as these and others that we might discuss all are very difficult to explain if we assume that the brain is what's producing our conscious experience. But instead, if we think of the brain as being almost like an antenna receiver or like a filtering mechanism, so the brain's actually limiting what we perceive. So if you think of the sun as being like consciousness, and there are lots of clouds in the sky, those clouds are like our brain, our thoughts, our emotions. The consciousness is more purely coming in when the brain is doing less. And I talk about a number of examples there. So it recontextualizes the brain as being something that can kind of process consciousness rather than produce it, which makes way for all sorts of phenomena like non-local consciousness. And that would be like telepathy or mind-to-mind communication. So I think that some of the strongest evidence for telepathy beyond many personal anecdotal cases it's known as the Gansfeld experiment. And the basic design is as follows. You have one person in a room, we'll call him Bob, and Bob is put into a relaxed meditative state. You have another person in another room named Jane, and Bob and Jane don't know each other. They're not claiming to have special psychic abilities, but Jane is shown a picture or a video, some kind of image by the experimenters. And the experimenters say, Jane, I want you to try to mentally send what you're looking at to Bob in the other room. So Bob doesn't know what Jane's looking at. He's apparently receiving something, but doesn't know what he's receiving. And he comes out of his relaxed state, and the experimenters show him 4 pictures, one of which is the picture that Jane was looking at and allegedly trying to mentally send to Bob. Now, if there were no effect at all, we would guess that over many, many trials and many experimenters, the person in Bob's room would guess the correct picture 1 out of 4 times, or 25%, if there's no effect. And that's what conventional science would predict, which is no, there shouldn't be any effect, and it should be totally random. It should approach 25%. However, that's not what happens. The studies show that it's closer to 32%. And when you run the math on studies like this, from a statistical standpoint, it's massively significant. It's one of those things where the odds that that is happening just by chance, that it's a 7% deviation, 32 versus 25%, it's more than 1 billion to 1 odds that against a chance occurrence there. So that's a really powerful study using the standards that we use in other areas of science, which suggests that some information seems to be getting through sometimes. And it actually conforms to our everyday experience, because if we were 100% telepathic all the time, then we would know each other's thoughts 100% of the time. And that doesn't seem to be happening for many of us. It's more subtle, where we think of someone and then maybe we get a text message later and we say, wait, that was kind of weird. I thought of the person, then I got a text. Maybe instances like that are kind of the extra 7% that seem to be getting through.
Very interesting. And I know in my work as a medical intuitive healer, for example, I work with a healing retreat in Costa Rica, and they will send me a report on the individual. It'll be like Joe Blow in Seattle, and he's got Parkinson's disease, or he's addicted to heroin, or he's trying to get off alcohol, or whatever his problem is. And then, he's born on this date, eats peanut butter and jelly for lunch. And I'll sit there, I'll focus on the gentleman's energy, and I'll write a medical intuitive report for hour and a half, 2 hours, just based on that information by tuning into that person. Sometimes I have a photograph, 90% of the time I don't even have a photograph. But it's about tuning in to that frequency of that particular individual. And but you feel that we all have these abilities, is that correct?
I think that's what the research suggests, and I think they occur in us in varying degrees. So the study that I referenced, where people are 32% successful versus 25%, which is the chance value, those are kind of everyday people who aren't claiming to have psychic abilities, and they aren't claiming to have even tried to foster them in any way. So maybe we could consider that as like a baseline, where the average person has this very, very subtle ability, whereas there are people with much stronger abilities. It's like a spectrum. Like any other skill, I like to compare it to basketball. Anyone can dribble a basketball. If you have an arm and a basketball, you can at least dribble it. But not everyone is LeBron James or Michael Jordan. There's this distribution. There's some people that are outliers and are very talented. And actually, the U.S. government has run programs on this. There's one in particular where psychic spies were used for national security over a more than 20-year period during the Cold War, and over $20 million was spent on this psychic spying ability. Those people seem to have much better than 32%, so to speak. They're much stronger, and there are other people that are practicing these things, whether it's medical intuition or otherwise, where it's stronger than the average person. So I think it's an important subtlety. Like when I hear some people ask about psychic abilities, they ask, well, is the person ever wrong? And that's not really what I'm after and what science is after. It's the question is, can the person perform better than what chance would predict? And to what degree is that the case? And there seems to be a degree of basically a variation of how much better than chance people are.
Yeah, it's my experience. My book, Unlimited Intuition Now, I talk about the 4 psychic gifts. And so, which are claircognizance, clairsentience, clairaudience, and clairvoyance. And each of us, this is about how you personally receive information at the soul level. So you may be really high in clairsentience, but you're not good at claircognizance. So it's just like school. You may be great at languages and bad at math. So you just have to figure out how your soul information comes to you. Now, Mark Gober, the author of End to Upside Down Thinking, is there evidence that we can know the future before it happens?
Well, like the studies with telepathy, there's some pretty extraordinary cases that are more anecdotal, where someone has a dream and then that exact thing happens the next day. There's a case that I reference in my book, a man from Virginia fairly recently. He dreamt the lottery numbers and then bought multiple tickets and won a few $100,000. So those are very difficult to explain, but those are kind of one-off cases. And we don't really know how it happens. But there are more systematic studies done, which I think are really compelling because, again, the statistics are there. And I'm continuing to mention statistics, and I think it's really important to think about that because the mainstream scientific community hasn't acknowledged these things as being real. And in everyday life, we're not feeling these subtle effects all the time. We maybe get a hunch about something, but it's hard to prove that was not just chance. These studies are important because they're looking at the math and saying, no, this is what chance would predict, and this is what the studies show. So the classic study, which is called a precognition or a presentiment study, meaning that we know or sense the future before it happens, is that it looks at a traditional psychological experiment, which I remember from my days studying psychology, where you show a person a picture on a computer. We'll call that picture the stimulus, in that it stimulates the body in some way. The picture is either a neutral one, like a picture of a mountain or a river, something that wouldn't stimulate the body in theory, or like an arousing picture, so a violent image or an erotic image, something that we know would stimulate the body. And what those studies show is that the person has an unconscious response. Like the skin responds when they see that arousing picture, their pupils dilate, their heart responds, their brain responds, all at a subconscious level. You have to measure it. What the experimenters have now more recently done, including Dr. Darrell Bem from Cornell, and he wrote a big paper on this because of his credibility that got a lot of attention several years ago, but they measured people's bodies before the pictures were shown, not after, before. And the experimenters don't know what picture is coming up because the picture is randomly selected by a computer. And the person sitting in the chair looking at the computer doesn't know what's going to come up. So no one knows consciously what kind of picture is going to come up. And yet the body seems to respond in a direction consistent with the eventual picture shown seconds before the picture even comes up, meaning the skin spikes like a few seconds before the picture comes up. And that, and again, in a direction consistent with the picture. So it will spike more if it's one of the arousing pictures versus a non-arousing picture like a neutral one. So that becomes very difficult to explain when we look at the statistics. And again, it's a very strong effect.
Now, one of the things that I can corroborate this with is simply muscle testing or kinesiology. So for example, you could take pictures, like you said, put them in an envelope. So for example, you could have a picture of Hitler, put it in an envelope, muscle test somebody, and they're going to go weak. Versus if you put a picture of, say, Gandhi in an envelope, the person can't even visually see the picture, but it's the energy and information that's contained in the picture that our consciousness, which as you say is non-local, is reacting to all the time. Now, is there evidence that we can impact physical matter with our mind alone?
Well, we think about the framework that I discussed in the beginning, which is that consciousness is primary, and I would say even more than being just fundamental, it's beyond all space and time. And that might explain things like precognition, because it's like consciousness is reaching forward in time. But if we adopt that metaphor, and another analogy that might be helpful to your audience is to consider that reality is like a stream of water, where water represents consciousness, and each of us is like a whirlpool within that stream. So we have kind of separated, localized experiences. It feels like they're separate, but we're actually connected as part of the same stream. So if we accept that to be true, then consciousness is the basis of this entire physical world. And if you buy that, then it's at least conceptually conceivable that the mind could affect matter, because the mind is the basis of matter under this idea. There's actually evidence to suggest that's true. Again, there's a kind of a spectrum. There's some extreme cases where the mind has pretty remarkable effects. There are cases of energy healing, and I wonder if you've probably seen some things in that area based on your practice. But in terms of the more subtle effects that have been tested statistically, like over and over and over again, where you see a small effect, the strongest studies have to do with computers or machines that are called random number generators. And these are machines that generate a 0 or a 1 in a random fashion. So when you look at the string of zeros and ones that are generated over a long period of time, you get close to 50% ones and 50% zeros, because it's totally random. It's like flipping a coin, heads versus tails. In these experiments, people are asked, the participants are asked to try to mentally influence the machine, even if they're not next to it. The experimenters say, I want you to try to will the machine with your intention to produce more ones than zeros. And sure enough, when we look at the statistics of the flow of ones and zeros that then come out, there's a statistically significantly there are more ones than zeros. But again, we have to use statistics to detect that. It's a very small but highly significant effect. So there we see the mind having an effect on a physical process without touching it.
Yeah, and I think also many in our audience are going to be super aware and aware of this fact. But my comment also is that you have to be responsible of what you're actually doing with your energy. And if you're trying to use your mind, your mental energy to control things that you really shouldn't be controlling, like the weather or other people, you're going to just be exhausted. I remember one time years ago going to a shaman, and he said, Catherine, you even try and control the weather. And I thought about it. I said, well, but what do I do on Wednesdays when I want to practice Qigong outside? He said, let it rain. So, a lot of times you may have a thought like, I would really rather have it this way. So we really want to practice the art of allowing and letting people and the universe be what they need to be.
Well, that's a great point. And I'll give you a study that I actually remember when I studied behavioral economics, which is all about how we make judgments and the kinds of biases that we have in our decision-making processes. And there's an effect that has stuck with me. It's called affective forecasting errors, like affective with an A. In other words, the studies suggest that we're really poor at predicting what we will like and predicting what we will dislike. And yet we act based on a place of thinking that we know what we're going to like and dislike. And yet when those things happen, they're much less of an effect than we think they will be. So we think we're going to like something, and then we get it, and we end up liking it way less. Or if we think something is so horrific, when it happens, it ends up being way less bad than we think it is. And I think it goes along with what you're saying. We have these desires that occur in the present moment. And sometimes if we just kind of surrender those desires and just allow things to happen, it ends up working out in ways that we can't predict.
Right. Let go, let God, the most powerful form of healing. Now, Mark Gober, author of An End to Upside Down Thinking, in your studies, what are near-death experiences? We've interviewed two people on the Natural Healing Show who've had near-death experiences, Carrie Clancy and Maz Sajadi. What are these near-death experiences, and why don't you think they are hallucinations?
Well, near-death experience is an instance where a person typically has some kind of physiological trauma. So they're in bad shape with their body. They might be in cardiac arrest. They might have a severe brain injury, something where they're kind of close to dying physically, and yet they have a very lucid experience. So it's kind of a paradox for the medical community, because in these instances, we have a brain that is sometimes completely turned off, or it's just barely functional in other cases, and yet the person is having logical thought processes and clear memories that are occurring during that time. It's hard to explain when the brain's not working and the person's consciousness is working, what's happening. There are hypotheses which say, well, that those things must just be hallucinations that are caused by the dying brain. So maybe the brain is trying to comfort us through some kind of evolutionary mechanism where when the brain thinks we're about to die, it releases positive chemicals and we have these very positive feelings. The reason I don't think it's a hallucination, among many that I list in the book, is that the experiences that are reported during the near-death experience one is called the out-of-body experience, where the person actually goes out of their body in terms of their consciousness, and they see or experience things in the room, or maybe sometimes even outside the room, that are later verified as being accurate by those who were lucid at the time. So like doctors or family members in the room, the person's resuscitated and they say, wait, I was over my body, I saw you doing this, I heard this person saying this. And the doctors and the people in the room don't understand how it could happen, because they saw that the person was on the table and they shouldn't have had a lucid consciousness. And yet the memories that are brought back are accurate. So that by definition is not a hallucination if it's an accurate report. And these are known as veridical out-of-body experiences, meaning what's reported is verified as being accurate. That is really hard to explain under conventional medical thinking. And I think we can explain it, however, if we adopt this alternative picture of consciousness, where consciousness is not dependent on the body.
Now, is there evidence that our consciousness survives when our physical body passes away?
The near-death experience points in that direction. It certainly doesn't give us hard evidence, because the person is resuscitated. So they aren't fully dead, even though they might be clinically dead. However, the studies I mentioned earlier on children with memories of a previous life, and the fact that they have such corroboratable memories where the researchers can find the medical records and the historical records, and sometimes the child's body actually reflects what happens, that might suggest that their consciousness continues from one body to the next. I think that's some evidence there. And that's how the University of Virginia researchers, I think, interpret it. They say that reincarnation would explain what happens there. And that is suggesting that the consciousness of one person continues on. There are also studies done on mediumship where people are communicating with the deceased. So I'm not talking about medical mediumship. I'm speaking of like people who claim they can talk to dead people, the consciousness of a dead person. There have been many reports of this and many people who practice this even today, but there were strong reports in the 1800s, and William James, the Harvard psychologist, studied this, and he found things he couldn't explain. But more recently, there have been studies done at the Windbridge Research Center where they've looked at mediums from a much more scientific standpoint, using the standards that are required today, where they use 5 levels of blinding. So in traditional science, we talk about double blinding, where certain people are not privy to information so that it's kind of a very pure trial. This is 5 levels of blinding. So the medium, the person claiming to communicate with the deceased, is on the phone with the experimenter. The experimenter gives the first name of a deceased person who has no relation to the researcher. It's someone else's deceased relative or loved one, not even the person on the phone. The person on the phone, the experimenter gives the first name to the medium and then asks a series of specific questions. And when they look at the responses from the mediums and rate and rank the responses, they find that the mediums are able to bring back information beyond what chance would predict, again, using statistics. And there have been 2 peer-reviewed journal papers published from the Windbridge Research Center, which suggest that mediums are able to get information about a dead person that we can't explain, which maybe suggests that the deceased person is communicating, or that consciousness is something that we can access beyond the person's physical death.
Now, is there evidence for past lives?
I think the strongest evidence that I mentioned is from the University of Virginia, and the fact that very credible people have been studying this for over 50 years. Dr. Ian Stevenson, Dr. Jim Tucker, and the cases of children are so compelling because we can't explain the specificity of the detail that these little kids are bringing back. And the fact that it happens in so many cases. Like if it were just one case, maybe you could say, well, the parents were feeding the information to the child, even though that's hard to reason in some cases. But when you have this large body, it's hard to shoot down all of them. There are some cases of people who kind of spontaneously talk about remembering a previous life, or it occurs in hypnosis, where the person is under hypnosis and then they are in a scene that from a previous life. There's a case I remember when I first started my research. I heard a woman on a podcast named Myra Kelly, who I believe she was a corporate attorney or some kind of mainstream job. She wasn't in the consciousness field to start, but she had a severe jaw or TMJ injury that the doctors couldn't figure out what was going on. And I think it was Columbia Medical School or a prominent medical or dental school looked at it and said, you're going to need to have jaw surgery, where they basically crack the jaw, and then it's a very severe process. She didn't want to have that. She tried past life regression hypnosis, where you go under hypnosis and you see if you recall anything. And I believe the first time she did it, no memories came back, but she tried it again, and she got a flash of a memory of being a slave in a previous life, where there was a big chain up against her jaw, like resting on her neck. And when she remembered that, she kind of reasoned why maybe she had the pain that she had, and then the pain went away magically. And the dentist could not figure it out. So now Myra, or at least as of the time I heard her on the podcast, she began practicing past life regression hypnotherapy because it changed her life so much, from corporate law into that field. So there are cases like that, even though hypnotherapy might not be quite as reliable as the cases that we see with children who have past life memories. There are some cases that are really hard to explain with conventional thinking, which suggests that maybe we do have past lives.
Now, Mark Gober, your real job, if we'll call it this, your day job, how about that? Your day job is with mergers and acquisitions for Sherpa Technology. How has the information that you write about in an end to upside down thinking, how has that affected your life and the way that you live and think?
My old thinking was very much along the materialist lines that I described in the beginning of the interview, that the brain produces consciousness, that matter produces consciousness, and therefore my identity, because our consciousness is how we perceive identity. Like right now, my sense of self comes from my consciousness, and I would have said that consciousness is derived from my body. So that means that my identity is my body and that I have a consciousness. What I think this alternative perspective suggests is that our identity is tied to our consciousness, and the body is like a vehicle of experience. We experience the physical world through the body, but that's not our identity. The identity is the consciousness. And furthermore, when the brain dies, under the materialist worldview, consciousness ceases. There's no memories, no thoughts, no feelings, no emotions. There can't be, because the brain's what's producing it. And when the brain turns off, it should be over. And that leads to a pretty bleak outlook on life. And that was my outlook. I reasoned that there can't be any meaning beyond just trying to rationalize, because once you die, it's over and everyone's going to be dead. So why should I care about anything? Even though I did care, and I kind of struggled with that. Like, wait, something good happens and I'm happy about it. Why am I happy? It doesn't matter in the end. And if something negative happened, why am I sad about it? It's not going to matter in the end. And that's how I thought about things until I started this research. And it now puts life into a new context where, at the very least, if consciousness continues beyond the body, that has meaning. But beyond that, I think we can look back to the near-death experience. There's something called the life review that is often reported. So if we view the near-death experience as not being a hallucination, and if we view it as being kind of a glimpse into maybe higher realities or alternative dimensions, sometimes people even report going to places that seem like other dimensions, like otherworldly places. People often report a life review where they experience their whole life kind of in a flash, and they're observing how they acted towards people at different times in their life. And sometimes they were not acting very well towards people, and they'll feel the pain that they inflicted through the eyes of the people that they affected. So they really feel it because they say, wow, look at how upset I made her by what I said. And typically those people come back very much changed in their lives. Recently, for my own podcast, which will be coming out in the next few months, I interviewed Daniel Brinkley, who has had 4 near-death experiences. And in each one, he had a life review, which started from the beginning. So I said, Daniel, have things gotten better? Because he kind of would start from the beginning, and then he would have a whole bunch of new stuff in the interim period in his life. And he said in fact, he did learn a lot because his life changed once he saw how he treated people. He became a hospice volunteer and just has a different outlook on life. In his prior life, earlier in his life, he was a Marine and worked in Vietnam, and he said he was vicious. He killed a lot of people. And in his life review, he experienced the deaths of the people that he killed through their eyes. And not only that, he experienced the pain of the children who would no longer have a parent because of what he did. So for him, it was a really profound experience. And this kind of makes sense, at least conceptually, if we're part of the same stream of consciousness, if we're all interconnected and not so separate. It seems like in this life review or near-death experience dimension, we're able to switch lenses and kind of go back and forth of what kinds of consciousness we're experiencing. So that life review has really had a big effect on me, because if that's what the meaning of life is about, or at least partially, it's mostly about how we're treating each other and not as much about the material stuff, about how big our house is or what kind of car we drive. That's not what people are talking about in the life review. In the life review, it's all about relationships and how we treat each other.
I always feel that the most selfish thing that I can ever do is be kind and generous to everyone. Because once you understand the law of karma is whatever you put out is what you receive back. If I'm kind and generous to everyone, that's what I receive back as well. Now, we're here at the Natural Healing Show. So how has this information changed the way that you personally take care of your body?
I view the body, kind of as I was just alluding to, as being a vehicle of consciousness. So our identities are consciousness, and the body is a way in which we experience the world around us. So it's an important tool for us to have whatever learning experiences that we're having here. And that's what it seems to be about, based on the research I've done, that we're here kind of to learn and evolve, at least in some capacity. So having a body that is capable is really important for that. So I think eating well and fitness and mental health, those are really important so that we can kind of be pure vehicles of consciousness. So if we view the brain as being like an antenna receiver, we want to make sure the antenna is really well kept up so that we can receive the signal purely. And I view that very differently than I used to, I was an athlete before, so I was very conscious of the body, but from a different standpoint. I was just thinking about athletics and just like maybe more material things. But now I kind of view things in a metaphysical sense and want to have the purest experience I can have here. And therefore taking care of the body, taking care of the vehicle is of high importance.
Yesterday I was doing a medical intuitive reading on a gentleman. And again, I just got his name and, information. I wasn't speaking to him personally, but this is someone who's going to a healing retreat. And this is a gentleman, mid-50s. He's a retired executive, financially set for life. And I'm reading his energy, and his goal for the healing retreat is to stop drinking alcohol. And in addition to that, he had a number of spiritual goals, one of which was to improve his own intuition. And I said to him, one of the things that's going to really help you to improve your psychic ability is to stop eating toxic food. And in his case, he needed to actually stop drinking alcohol because these toxins are actually held in our energy field. So it's not just what we're eating or what we're drinking. They literally cloud our energy field, and that can interfere with our ability to read, the consciousness around us accurately.
Yeah, that's what I've seen that in the research too. What we put in the body has a real effect on how we're processing things, and taking an artificial substance that can artificially dull or excite the body can have negative effects sometimes.
Absolutely. And personally, I don't take any drugs, legal or illegal. It's important to me to keep my own energy field very clear in order to do what I do as a medical intuitive healer. Now, in your book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, you have a lot of information, again, that helps us shift out of materialism. What are the implications for medicine and natural healing?
Well, I'll go back to what I mentioned early in the interview, the idea that there's a third factor that affects our physical form, that it's not just our genetics, not just our environment, although those do play a role in things, there's at least another factor, and who knows, maybe more. The idea that consciousness or information or some kind of energy is affecting our body. And we see from the psychokinesis studies of mind affecting matter that I referenced, where the intention of a person can affect the outcome of a physical machine, where more ones are produced than zeros based on a person's mind. Well, that's a physical machine. Our body's physical. So what do our thoughts and intentions do to our body? I think, at least for me, thinking about our intentions and our thoughts and our mindset, those are much more important to me than they used to be in terms of health, because our body's physical and our mindset seems to be able to affect the physical world. So it would make sense. It wouldn't hurt, at least, to try to have a positive mindset and keep positive intentions.
Yeah, and for our audience, I take my mindset very seriously, and I wake up every day and consciously set my vibration by thinking the most positive thoughts that I can. Even with it starting with thinking about all the people that I love, all the people that I care about, how thankful I am to be alive, and then doing my work prayerfully and asking for guidance and asking to be guided in all that I do. And by starting the day in this really positive frame of mind, you start at this super high vibration, which affects everything, right?
I think that's a really smart technique, because sometimes we can wake up and then we see an email and it kind of sets us on the wrong track. But when you elevate in the way that you describe, I think it's really effective.
Now, what are the implications for happiness, love, and beauty from your research?
Hmm. Well, happiness is something that I always used to question, like what leads to lasting happiness? And at least in my own life, I wasn't seeing it happen, even though I was objectively achieving things. And this goes back to what I mentioned, affective forecasting, that we're not always so good at it. When we think, oh, when I get this, I'm then going to be happy. That doesn't seem to happen as much as we think. And there's a term for it. It's known as the hedonic treadmill. It's like we're on a treadmill. We're running and it feels like we're progressing, but then we end up in the same exact state. And that might explain why we have billionaires or very famous people who on the surface we would think that they would be so happy based on whatever objective means that we use to judge happiness. And yet those people sometimes are suicidal or they're depressed. We see that all the time. So something beyond the material seems to be leading to lasting happiness. And for me, I think it all has to do with this picture of reality that we're describing. If we view consciousness as being fundamental, then there really is no out there to be going after, because everything out there is just within our consciousness, always. Even though we interpret it with our mind as being something external, there is no external. It's always processed within our consciousness. So really, all that's going on is our own consciousness, this kind of one big stream, to use the analogy that I mentioned from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, that we're all whirlpools in a stream. So if we think about that, then if there's no external, then what are we striving for externally? That's kind of a false errand. There's nothing you can do there. So I think bringing things to the inside and saying, how do we kind of access pure consciousness? How do we access those rays of the sun and remove some of the clouds that are blocking that consciousness or good feelings that seem to be coming from it? If we think about the near-death experience, what's often reported is highly positive emotions and feelings of unconditional love. That's often what's reported. And we see that with psychedelic use sometimes. There are a number of cases where we see reductions in brain functioning associated with heightened consciousness or heightened positive emotions. So it might be the case that getting these rays of consciousness, of pure consciousness, that's where happiness actually comes from. It's from the consciousness itself. And what happens is that we are blocking it artificially. So we then say, well, the drug that we take makes us feel better. And we misattribute the drug or whatever external thing, even if it's getting a job or a relationship, it's still external. those things are just removing the clouds, and we say, no, that thing gave us the happiness, when in fact all that thing did was block what was already there. And that's a big shift of saying the happiness is already there within us, and we don't need to go out and get it. It's a matter of dealing with things internally.
So there's no out there.
Right. Right.
So,
If we think about anything we consider to be out there, every time we consider it out there as an objective reality, it's always experienced subjectively in our consciousness. There's no example that it can be excluded from that. It's always within.
so Mark Gober, author of An End to Upside Down Thinking, any final thoughts for our audience?
Well, if these topics are somewhat new to you, at least the way that I've framed them, I can just say from my personal experience, it was a very gradual shift to internalizing these ideas. And if they're new, it can be like a real shock to the system of like, wait, I didn't know about that study. Wow, that really changes how I think about reality. And it can take time to integrate the ideas. And for me, it's been a few years now. In the beginning, I was very resistant to it, and I didn't know how to incorporate some of the ideas because it challenged my worldview so much. But over time, very gradually, it's kind of sunk in and it's become internalized, and it's caused a very positive shift in my life. So if some of the ideas are new and they contradict what you think about reality, my advice would be to just kind of let it sink in, and over time, it might end up having a really positive effect.
You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. You can find out more about Mark Gober at markgober.com. And remember, there's no outside out there. And when you create the energy to feel good, you're going to feel your wonderful natural health naturally. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.